Good evening, everyone. I'm Carl Weisenbach, the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home. And on behalf of the foundation and the staff, I want to wish you, actually say thank you for waiting on the train out there, which is a constant problem that we have here, but nonetheless, we survived it. It could be worse things happening. So anyway, welcome to this great institution, and we've got a great program lined up for you this evening. And I want to introduce the moderator of the program, Mr. Tim Rees, who is the Deputy Director and Supervisory Archivist of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home. And Tim came to Abilene in 2008. Tim went to Wichita State University, which I wasn't going to mention, because there's a certain game going on. As I said, Tim went to Wichita State University, which he'd like me to remind you is playing in the Sweet 16 at this very moment. So I did that, Tim. Yeah. Tim went to grad school at Emporia after 5 years in the Army. So that's just a very brief resume or whatever of Tim. And Tim, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. We have a lot of familiar faces I see in the audience tonight. We have General and Mrs. Arter from Fort Leavenworth. Always great to see you. We have our former Deputy Director, Mac Teasley, and his wife, Inga. We have Wes Jackson from Salina and the Land Institute, who has an important Eisenhower tie, of course. I think we've got some other, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to walk on your applause there. Former staff members tonight, David Haight, and I think I saw Joe over here as well, and of course a number of other current staff members. So welcome everybody. I'm going to give just a very brief biography of John, and then I'll talk a little more about our guest, and then we'll get into our conversation in earnest, which as the evening goes on, would like you all to contribute to that conversation as well. John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower was born August 3rd, 1922 in Denver, Colorado. And although he would be raised really as an only child, he was the second-born son to Ike and Mamie. He was preceded by his brother Dowd, Dwight Eisenhower, who, as we know, passed as a toddler. John's first overseas posting as a child was in Panama, where his father served an important apprenticeship under General Fox Connor. John's Army childhood would take him to Kansas, to Washington, D.C., to Paris, France, and the Philippine Islands, where he attended high school. John then followed his father's steps to West Point, where he graduated on a very important day, both in Eisenhower family history and world history, June 6, 1944, and then was able to join Ike in France for some time after he graduated. John taught English at West Point, which I know is one of his great passions. He then fought in the Korean War, where he earned the Bronze Star and the Combat Infantryman's Badge, and then served, of course, in his father's White House. Once Ike left the White House, John followed his father to Gettysburg, where he and Bill Ewald assisted in writing the presidential memoirs, and Dr. Ewald just passed away earlier this week, as a matter of fact.
Oh, he did?
John would then follow his own literary dreams, beginning in the mid-1960s, producing a series of books, very well received. Histories, The Bitter Woods was his first book, which is about the Battle of the Bulge, and many others which are on display tonight and conveniently for sale in our gift shop as well. So you want to keep that in mind. And while I'm thinking about it, John's last book, American General, about William Tecumseh Sherman, was published just recently. And so we're lucky to have yet another John Eisenhower book for us to read.
May I just add to that real quick?
Certainly.
He completed that 2 weeks before he had the episode that would kill him. So that tells you where his mind was. His entire life, he was really a lucky man. He was completely together.
Got the job done.
Yeah.
And then another important aspect of John's life, it's probably not as well known, he was appointed the U.S. ambassador to Belgium from 1969 to 72, and I'm sure you have lots of memories of that experience. Mary Jean, so that brings us to our guest tonight, who I'll introduce. Mary Jean Eisenhower is the youngest daughter of John and currently resides in the Kansas City area, and as we know, is also a frequent visitor here to Abilene. She was born while her grandfather was president, and I read recently that you were christened in the Blue Room of the White House. She lived with her family in Pennsylvania near Gettysburg, near her grandparents, until John's appointment as the ambassador to Belgium. Mary was associated with People to People International for many years, an organization founded by President Eisenhower, and she was most recently the president and chief executive officer at People to People. She's the recipient of many honors and honorary degrees, including the Knight of Peace Award from the International University in Assisi, Italy, and an honorary doctorate of humane letters from both Park University and William Jewell College in Missouri near Kansas City. Mitch Yockelson, my National Archives colleague, is an archivist, has a very unusual job at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington. He works in the office of the Inspector General, and he's a member of the ART team, which is the Archival Recovery Team. And Mitch actually helps recover items that may actually belong in the National Archives and have fallen into other hands. Additionally, he teaches history at the United States Naval Academy and military history at Norwich University. Mitch also leads tours to France of World War I and World War II battlefields. He's frequently on television. He's been on 60 Minutes, PBS, the History Channel, and is often quoted in the national media as well. Mitch received his Bachelor of Science from Frostburg State University, an MA from George Mason, and a PhD from the Royal Military College of Science at Cranfield University in the United Kingdom. So welcome both Mary Jean
Thanks, Tim.
and Mitch. And I think, Mary Jean, we should start with you tonight and talking about John Eisenhower.
Okay, you reserve the right to pull the cane at any time because this is like home movies, okay? It's nothing really historically official except just little known things about my dad. It's really an honor and joy to be here, and really I'm so pleased with this program because you know, Daddy was kind of the unsung hero with Granddad. He was by his side through thick and thin, and very few people knew that he really was privy to and a part of most of what happened. So it makes me so happy that you know, it's time to bring out into the light some of what John did. And not that makes anything that Dwight did any less, but Daddy was he was a multifaceted person. He was often misunderstood. He was a very, very deep thinker and observer, and thought about everything that came out of his mouth. He lived in a formal world, but he really loved and reminisced about his time here in Kansas when he would spend summers with his grandmother. In fact, there's an artifact in the back of the museum where what was left of the Eisenhower brothers, the ones that were around, and Daddy, and I guess David, the father, they laid a block of concrete out at the boyhood home, and they all signed it. But then you see at the bottom Johnny, and underneath that Boss. So I think he was the youngest one there. I'm not sure. But as a father, I could not have picked up one that would be equal to him in any way. He was both kind, and we were one of a kind in that we were kind of the different branch of the family, if you will. His humor was dry and subtle, but when you got to know it, it was insatiable. And he looked so much like his father, which was really the good news and the bad news. He kind of grew up in the shadow of his brother, and then his adulthood was spent in the shadow of his father, but he was always gracious about it. But I think at times he wanted to, you know, and he certainly did. His last 30 years came out and became an historian in his own right, and nobody could attach that to anybody but him, and I think that made him very happy. He did tell me one time, he was kind of, you know, he was looking aggravated, but he wasn't saying anything, and I asked him what was wrong, and he said, you know, sometimes it's just hard to be John Eisenhower. So I don't know what he meant by it, but anyway. But there was a very human side to him as a father that was actually a lot of fun. He had a very dry sense of humor, as the artists probably know. I was climbing a tree. This is, now, I have to tell you that the Gettysburg farm, of course, it was outside of Gettysburg. It wasn't like downtown or anything, and our property abutted the farm, and so we were pretty secluded. But I got stuck in a tree. I had climbed a tree, and my mom was, I don't know, cleaning out the attic or something, but she couldn't hear me yelling for her. And finally, some time went by, and Daddy came home from work. He was helping Granddad work on his memoirs at that time, so you can imagine how long ago it was. And there I am in the tree. So finally, he pulls into the driveway, and I'm going, I can't get down, I can't get down. I found out then that I'm actually afraid of heights, but it was even a baby tree. Anyway, so Daddy was one of these very down-to-earth, outside kind of people, but he also worried about things like his suits. You know, he was trained. So he came over to the tree, and he dropped a suit so that he wouldn't do anything to it, and in his boxers and t-shirt climbed to the top of the tree and got me and brought me down. And he had so much fun, he went back up to the top and started kind of swinging the tree because it was and then my mother managed to be in the kitchen, and she looks out and she has a panic attack, and anyway, he came in very soon. And then with my niece, one time it was kind of cute. My niece's first language was Spanish. She spent her first 3 years in Colombia, and when my sister was moving back to New York, I was home that summer with my parents, and I got to watch Adriana, and Adriana didn't speak English. I learned my first Spanish phrase that summer, which is "Venga mamacita," and that means "come home, mother." But anyway, we had a swimming pool in the backyard. This is in Valley Forge, and she was in the shallow end. I had her there, and she just started screaming bloody murder and ran up the steps of the shallow end, and she stood running in place right by the pool, and just, you know, in all this Spanish, and I had no idea what she was saying, pointing to it. Well, Daddy, meanwhile, was over on kind of a lawn chair, and he had like the newspaper over his face, and you know, obviously he was trying to get some rest, and finally he took the newspaper off, and he's looking around trying to figure out what the hullabaloo is about. And he goes over to the pool, and he goes in, and she's run out at this point, and she's still screaming. But he's in the shallow end, so he pulls her in with him and holds her. And finally she pointed to the bug, and he saw what it was, and he says, "Oh, well, don't worry about old Buggo. We'll just take him to his casa in the field." So the look of relief on her face was just precious. He scooped the bug up, and he had her in this arm, and they walked over to the grassy part and threw the bug out. She was very happy. But, and one other kind of nutty story about him. We moved from that house in Valley Forge to a different one that he used to call the Alamo, because it was a stone house and it had a flat roof, and it was at the bottom of almost a perpendicular driveway. And when it would ice up, he'd park at the top and walk down, because it would be impossible to get the car out. And this particular evening, he slipped at the top of the hill, and he started to slide down, and he stuck his briefcase under him to save his suit. The suits were very important to him. And he said he just flew. And he got to the bottom, and he had so much fun, he climbed up to the top and did it again. So, and you mentioned that he was ambassador to Belgium. I think this story is probably unique to any U.S. ambassador. But there was one sign with Daddy, you know, if he was fatigued or something like that, that if he was wearing his sunglasses and his robe at the breakfast table, you just didn't bother him. And this particular morning, I had just gotten an invitation to go to Portugal to rake tar off of beaches after an oil tanker spill. And I was going to try to extract $75 from him. Back then, it cost $75 for 3 weeks, a long time ago. But so I go barreling down to the breakfast table, ready to ask him, and I see Daddy, you know, he's got his nylon socks on and his garter and his silk robe and his sunglasses, and he's just sitting there. And I said, okay, well, this isn't the time. So a couple hours later, he was at the office, and I thought, well, I'll go over. The embassy was attached to the residence, so I thought, well, I'll go over and ask him now. So I went up I went over to his office was on the 9th floor, and when I went into his office, he was standing next to the window, and he's looking down onto the street. And I started to ask him, and it was like he didn't hear me. And he says, "Mary, come over here." He said, "What's that?" And on the street in front of the embassy was a flower power van, and there were some protesters, Vietnam War, carrying signs and circling the van. And back then, security amounted to a wrought iron gate and some Marine guards. So the Marine guards were inside, and those guys were outside of the gate. He said, "What do you suppose their problem is?" And I said, "I think it's Vietnam." And he said, "Well, I got to go talk to them." And he, made a beeline to the elevator. Well, I followed him. He gets down to the lobby. The Marine guards, stand up and salute him. And he just walks right past them like they weren't even there. And then they're getting nervous. And so he went outside and he started talking to the people who were protesting. And they got a great rapport going. And he was really, really listening, and they could tell, and they appreciated it. And they said, "We've been out here for a while. Would you like to sit in the van with us and talk to, and relax?" And he said, "Sure." So he pulled his pants up so that he wouldn't shine up his knees, right? And he went in, and the Marine guards were like going crazy. They said, "We don't advise that." And he said, just one of those. And he went in, and they talked for probably about 30 minutes, and he got out of the van. And they went off smiling and happy and waving at him, and he's waving back. And he says, "Man, I'm glad I'm not your age." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I'd be a hippie." Anyway, in 1992, the trip that the artist and we took, Daddy and I went to Normandy and different places that he was at during World War II. And we were at the Normandy Museum, and you can imagine there were pictures that size of Granddad in there. And Daddy kind of left a little bit, he left a little soon, and he started walking around and, just talking to people. He was fluent in French, and he started talking to people outside, and you could tell he was just kind of getting a feel for it now, and it was really kind of touching to watch it. And meanwhile, I just stood out there and kind of watched him just to make sure he was okay and all that. And meanwhile, this guy, I assume he was Welsh by his accent, came running up to him and he said, Sir, excuse me, sir, has anybody ever told you look just like Eisenhower?" So Daddy gets a little cagey and he says, "I've heard it a couple of times." And I'm like, "Daddy, it's obviously important to him. Tell him." And he said, No. I mean, you look more like the man than the man." So finally Daddy introduced himself and he said, "Oh, wow." And the guy was all excited and he said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm in a zoo. I look so much like him." So, but I like that you look more like the man than the man. And then along the same line, when I was working for an engineering firm, there was this young engineer in the office that really he was like fresh out of school and wet behind the ears, and he just thought he knew everything. And he saw my name tag and he said, "Mary Eisenhower." He said, "Are you any relation to the Stovers?" And I'd never get that. And I went, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am. That was my grandfather's mother." He says, "Yeah, she was from a place near Rigg, West Virginia." And I thought, this kid thinks he knows it all. I said, "No, she's from Virginia." He said, "It was Virginia at the time." Oh, okay. So if you fast forward a couple of months, my father came to the office to visit me, and this guy goes, "Wow, may I have my picture made with you?" And Dad said, "Sure." So they got the picture made, and when Daddy left, he said, "I'm going to go home to Rigg, West Virginia, and I'm going to tell everybody that I met Ike." And I said, "Well, he's been dead for years." And he said, "They won't know that." But at the end of the day, not only the amazing things he did while alive proved who he was, but also how he left. And I hope you don't mind, because this is a little bit on the sentimental side, but I wrote a blog right after he died, and I'd like to share parts of it with you. I updated it a little bit because some of it was written in the future. But We just laid Daddy to rest a year ago next month. He had full military honors. He is buried next to his own hero, Winfred Scott. My father grew up in a complicated world. He craved simplicity. He was shy, but he trained himself to be social. Sometimes the shyness could be interpreted as distant. However, nothing was further than the truth. He had many fires throughout his life, which he internalized. It was always about others. Truth be known, he was brilliant, had an amazing sense of humor, and could be implicitly trusted. He graduated West Point on D-Day and was sent immediately to be with my grandfather, who was executing the largest military event in history. And writing eventually became his passion, with a close tie on the Army. I asked him a couple of years ago if he would consider taping the backstory. He'd seen so much that no one else ever saw. He told me that the information at the time was classified, and it remains so. He took the backstory with him. What integrity. It didn't end up at Barnes & Noble. It's hard to fathom what he must have carried with him all of his life. Growing up with him and all throughout my adult life, Daddy was my go-to. He always knew what to say, even if he didn't agree with the conversation. And when there was trouble, he built me up. When I made mistakes, he allowed them, and he allowed me to be myself. He was there to help me figure it out, and I always felt wonderful after I saw or talked to him. Everything was all right, not because Daddy had this, but because he enabled me to say, I've got this. On the 21st of March, if I had to find one word to describe Daddy, it would be gracious. He had an episode on Thanksgiving morning, and as I sat next to his bed, he told me he thought he was in trouble this time. He told me that I would have to look after him. Of course, I said I would, but I touched him on the arm when he said that, and he opened his eyes and he said, "Oh, don't worry about me. I've lived a great life." He lasted almost another month, during which he ended up in the hospital. I think his biggest fear about death was being in the hospital. His own father had lived 9 months in one and died there. It became his mission then to get home. After days of begging the doctors to let him go home, on the 20th of December, they finally agreed to release him as a hospice patient, as otherwise he couldn't be released. Still, it took until early evening for them to get an ambulance to transport him. His wife, Joanne, stayed home that day to coordinate equipment and such that he would need at home, so I was blessed with him all to myself. When the ambulance finally got there to take him home, I rode with him. I think he would have passed a couple of times in the ambulance, but I kept asking him questions, which kept that brilliant mind going. I even asked him if he thought that the swans would be out when he got home, and he opened his eyes and he said, "Not at this time of the year." It meant so much for him to get home, and I think that was probably the most difficult thing I've ever done, was putting him in that ambulance, because I knew he was going home to die. But then he taught me, as he had many times throughout his life, I realized what absolute unconditional love is. When we got there, the elation on his face when he realized he was home was something. It was almost as though he was coming home from the war all over again. I'll treasure that expression forever. Joanne had his bed in front of the window in his bedroom so he could see his favorite view, the pier. He and I traded pictures of it for years. He was a 91-year-old whiz at the iPad. Don't worry, this is short, the rest of it. Finally, I was exhausted, and I told him I was going to go to the hotel to get some sleep. He smiled wide, and then I told him I'd see him in the morning. His brow furrowed, and I had the feeling that he likely wouldn't make the night. He died the next morning, my birthday, on December 21st, before anyone was up. The beauty of the last thing he saw, the pier, was his personal stairway to heaven. God has his arms around both of us, and we're both okay. So hail and farewell to an American hero. John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, you were a gracious man in life and passing on. I'll love you forever.
Thank you for sharing that, Mary. I think what we'll do now is catch up on our slides a little bit, then we'll turn to Mitch. John with his father in Panama in 1923, and of course, as you all know, that Panama was one of those real turning points in General Eisenhower's life when he became an apprentice to General Fox Connor, who we'll see here in a minute. Here they are up in Denver, the day he was christened, 1924. There he is at age 1.
My grandson looks just like him.
That's my favorite. That's Fox Connor kissing John goodbye from Panama. In Italy, Ike and Mamie and John spent the year 1928 and 1929 in Paris. Ike was there to help rewrite the guidebook to the American battlefields. And it was really important in his career because, much to Ike's disappointment, he did not go to France during World War I, but that year that he had in the late 1920s, he was able to travel to every battlefield of that conflict. And so he actually had more firsthand knowledge of some of that terrain than the people who had actually fought in the war. And of course, was invaluable, during the Second World War. And we have a number of really great pictures from a trip they took and drove all across Europe during their stay in Paris. And there's a little Frenchman with his beret and
Like his socks.
another part of the trip with the family of the Grubers, and I believe he became a brigadier general eventually, his comrade. And then back to Washington, where they were from 1929 till the time they went to the Philippines. And Ike was the assistant to the Assistant Secretary of War, and then went to work under General Douglas MacArthur, and then followed MacArthur to Panama. And I believe John that's his camera, and he was quite a photographer, starting as you can see, as a boy. There he is, what, high school, I suppose, freshman year maybe? He would have been, what, 14 or so?
Yeah.
36. It was probably about a 3-week trip or so. Ike in his kimono. Is that his high school graduation picture?
It is. And it's actually black and white that's been oil
colored,
painted.
yeah.
I've got the original.
And there he is. You see, he's grown quite a bit there at West Point during the middle of the war. Ruth Butcher was married to Captain Harry Butcher, who was Ike's naval aide during the war, and wrote a book called, basically a diary called My 3 Years with Eisenhower. And then, of course, Ruth and Milton Eisenhower's children in Washington during the war. Harry went to visit his father just right after he graduated from West Point. And I know, and I'm sure Mary Jean and Mitch can talk more to this, that there was, I think, some frustration in that, of course, the Army wanted to protect General Eisenhower's son and then President Eisenhower's son, and that probably affected the jobs that John could get in the Army, just from wanting to maintain his safety.
Well, in Korea, he had a German Shepherd as a Secret Service. Because he was, Granddad was president-elect, and Daddy was in open combat, so they couldn't.
Yeah.
The dog did die for him.
Is that right?
Mhm.
My gosh. Oh, skipped one there. So was John an inch or two taller than his dad?
Granddad was about 5'10", and Daddy was about 6'2".
Oh, that was quite a bit, yeah.
And Mimi was 5'2". We couldn't, it just must have been one honking recessive gene, I don't know.
Well, your cousin Earl Eisenhower
He was very tall,
Mhm.
yeah.
I believe that's the year that John met your mother, is that right? Or they got married in 1947?
They got married in 1947.
In fact, there we go.
I wore that dress too.
And that was a famous part of Ike's 1952 campaign in that October, that the unpopularity of the Korean War, he vowed that he would go to Korea if elected president. Of course, that really, instilled a lot of confidence in the American people because they knew that Ike knew how to finish a war. And so he did make good on his promise. Truman kind of teased him a little bit after the election, said, my plane's available if you still want to go to Korea now that the election's over. Yeah, which he did, and there he is in Korea with John. And then at Gettysburg, and I believe that John was opposed to his father seeking a second term, at least for a time.
That's something that went past me, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. All those people on the side are all family.
They're all family?
Uh-huh. You got, let's see, Milton, you got, let's see. I think that's Milton. One of the two of them. I can't see it from here, but I was identifying them earlier. And then that's Mimi's sister, Aunt Mike.
Mm-hmm.
And then, is that Mimi, or was it the other way around? They look alike. That's Mimi, and then Aunt Mike's next to her,
Okay.
and then Nana, Mimi's mother, and then my mother, and Gordon Moore,
Okay.
Aunt Mike's husband.
And David's famous birthday party with Roy Rogers.
Look at the look in his eye. I love that. Like, I gotta get these candles out.
The USS Eisenhower, and of course, most years for the annual dinner, we have sailors from the USS Eisenhower come to the library, who received Eisenhower Leadership Awards.
That's right.
Back here to the library. I think that takes us back to, now, Mitch, you really had a unique relationship, I'd say, with John Eisenhower, and your role as an archivist and historian, and knowing John in that phase of his life. You want to tell us how you two became acquainted and your work together over the years?
I've had a really good career as a historian, and certainly the highlight of it was getting to know your dad on not only as for helping him with some of his books, but we developed a friendship, and I certainly would say gracious is the way that I would describe him. He was extremely gracious, and the same thing I would certainly with Joanne. And they treated me incredibly well. I informally met him when his book on the Mexican War came out, and he gave a talk at the National Archives and did a book signing, and I bought the book and had him sign it, not knowing that several years later I would get a call out of the blue. I was working at the National Archives as a reference archivist, and I specialized in the World War I records, and he introduced himself on the phone. He had gotten my name from an acquaintance of ours and told me that he wanted to write a book about the U.S. Army in World War I, and he needed my help. So I was just so excited, and I invited him and Joanne to come to the archives, and I did all this preparation. I figured out what records I think that he should look at, and because there hadn't been a really solid book on that topic in some years, and I was getting to know the records, and I knew where all the so-called cool stuff was that nobody else had used. And he and Joanne came over, and I got permission from my boss to take him into stacks, and I showed him all these things, and the whole time he's just shaking his head and he's smiling, shaking his head, and I'm thinking, okay, this is great. He's gonna use all of this stuff. So at the end of the day, we shook hands, and he said, I'll send you a list. I gave him a finding aid to take home with him. I said, just tell me what records you want. I'll get them pulled for you. A couple of days later, I got a phone call from him, then a fax. He requested everything that was not what I showed him, but stuff from other books and so forth. And I was completely taken back, but it was okay, because as I got to know him in one of our conversations that we had, and we talked about his role as a historian, and he corrected me, and he said, I don't really consider myself a historian. I consider myself a storyteller. And that's exactly what John was. And he would write books usually on subjects, including the last one that was published posthumously on Sherman. But he would write books on topics that had already been done, but he would take his unique spin. And I really got to respect that, and I got to understand that. And throughout his writing, I got to know him and helping him and advising him what records to look at if he wanted to come to the archives. And it got to a point later on in his life where it was too much of a bother, and I couldn't blame him for coming to the National Archives at College Park, where most of the records he was interested. So I would get things for him, or I would introduce him to other people. But through that period, we also developed a friendship, and on numerous occasions he invited me to his home in Trapp, or I would meet him somewhere, and either he and I would have lunch, or with Joanne as well. And some of the same things would happen. People would come up to him, and they'd just stare at him. And he was very gracious, and he would, they'd come up and say, oh, your grandfather was the greatest commander of all time. He was the greatest president. And he would just smile and shake his hand. And then when they'd leave, he'd whisper to me and say, I wonder if they know that I'm a historian, that I've written books. And we would just sort of laugh at that. And I remember Joanne telling me a story. I don't think it was the same trip that you were in France, but I think it was in '94 for the 50th of Normandy. And the fact that he looked a splitting image of his father, she said that she would have to keep him sequestered in a hotel room. It was like he was the Beatles, and he couldn't go out on the street, or Elvis Presley. She would have to go get his lunch for him. And he would, in one of the things that I really cherish the most and miss the most about him is that we would have these great conversations about history. And he loved to tell stories about when he was ambassador to Belgium, but more about people that he met. And I wrote a small biography of Douglas MacArthur, and he told me the great stories about how MacArthur didn't treat his father all that well, but stories that he would meet MacArthur, and knowing Patton and Churchill and Stalin, and the guy that I admired that he didn't really care for, John J. Pershing. And to me, in what makes it kind of bittersweet is the fact that he really was the last link between all of those people. Yeah. I mean, he knew some of the greatest people in the world, the most influential. I wouldn't put Stalin as a great person, but he knew these people. He met them. He shook their hand. So every time I would shake John's hand, I realized I was shaking the hand of somebody who shook the hand of John Pershing or Winston Churchill or George Patton. He knew all these people, and I don't know if enough people recognized that about him, that he had that link to the past. And you mentioned about his memory. His memory was incredible. Like I said, I met him in the late 90s, and we got to know each other on a personal level, and he knew about relationships that I was in my life. And he would bounce back to those every so often. I think, how in the hell does he remember the name of my former girlfriend or so forth? But he always remembered stuff. And he wanted to know, like what I was working on. And I've been working on a World War I book for the past couple of years. So I would call him up, and I miss that terribly, to be able to say to him, well, what do you think about the First Army and General Liggett here? And he'd give me his advice and that kind of thing. And we would, that kind of level of friendship and getting to know him and learn the craft of a storyteller / historian was something that, I'll never forget. And you mentioned about him in his bathrobe and his socks. And when I would go to the house, he didn't care. He was dressed very casually, even if we went out somewhere in Trapp to have lunch. But one of the last times that I saw him, he and Joanne had invited me for lunch, and it was always the same sort of protocol. We would sit down in this long circular sofa in the TV room in the library, and we would talk history stuff. And he was at the time working on a dual biography of Theodore Roosevelt and Leonard Wood. And I lent him some books, and much to my surprise and delight, he had dedicated the book to me. It was also published posthumously, but we would have these conversations, and he'd ask my opinion, and I'd ask him questions and things, and then it was like it was regimented. Then we'd have lunch. We'd go sit at the dining room table overlooking the beautiful view in the river. And one time Carl was with me, and we had lunch there as well. And then we talked for a little while, and then usually it was time to go home. But for some reason, this last time, he excused himself and went into the bedroom to take a nap, and Joanne and I started in a conversation. I helped her clean up, and it seemed to go on and on and on. And all of a sudden, he came out of the bedroom, and he gave me that look that he was famous for, like, you have overstated your welcome. And I knew it was time to leave, but I respected that, and I respected him just as a person and how he treated me and how smart he was, and just really his importance through his professional career. And really, you know, he would say to me also that it was important for him to make his own mark, that, you know, living under the shadows of, I think, the greatest president of all time, and certainly one of the top, you know, Army commanders ever, to be able to live in that, it's got to be difficult. And the fact that he was such a prolific author, and I'm really proud that the last book he did on William Sherman, he had, like a lot of historians, a tough time getting publishers. The publishing world, if you're not familiar with it, and I've learned the hard way as well, is extremely difficult. And you would think with all the books that John published that publishers would be eager to come after and want to get a book. We had a difficult time, and I introduced him to some folks at the University of Missouri Press who published this book on Anzio and the book on Statesman. But he was really having a tough time, and I got lucky to get an agent who had an interest in my World War I book. And I told John about it. He's like, oh, I don't know. I said, just tell me, and I'll put the two of you in touch. So he finally one day on that iPad, which somebody bought him, and I get these emails that, you know, I could barely read them sometimes, but I had a general, he said, will you call your agent for me? So sure enough, I did, and the agent was just beside himself. John Eisenhower wants me to represent him. So I put the two of them together, and sure enough, this guy got him a publisher. In fact, the same editor that I'm working with, the World War I book. And it's just obviously sad that the book came out, you know, he didn't get a chance to see it in fruition and do the final edits and so forth. But it made me really proud that I was able to help him at the end, because he really was such an inspiration for me as a historian, and I will always be grateful for that.
You mentioned his storytelling, and in addition to just the straight history books, I love his memoirs, Strictly Personal, and then General Ike. So if you want a place to start reading John Eisenhower books, I would recommend those. And I love the story from Strictly Personal about Patton's children. And Patton would actually encourage his children to swear. And in fact, the more colorful, the more he enjoyed it. And he would actually reward his children financially if they really enrolled something, you know, eloquently.
Like a unique combination.
Profane, yeah. I'll share one story, and then I want to invite some others of you to share stories. But I didn't get to know John well, unfortunately, but we did, you know, exchange emails and talk on the phone occasionally. And John Eisenhower did not suffer fools gladly, and I did make him angry one time and had quite a disagreement, and I was very disappointed. But I told my son, I said, not everybody gets to make somebody famous angry at them. And so at least I can claim that I made somebody famous angry at me. But always enjoyed any, you know, conversation I had with John. And I'd learned something new about his father or about history, or he just had so many, you know, interesting stories. So again, we don't have a microphone out in the stand, so if any of you, whether Wes or Mac or General Arter, or those of you who knew John well would like to come up and say something, or you're welcome to at this time.
I would like to mention that John and Joanne were here, as you know, for the celebration for his father's 100th birthday.
Right.
In 1990. And we were here, and the plan was that they would come home with us and stay with us in Leavenworth overnight. And it was such a joy to be with them and to see them relax. And we invited Bob's best friend from college who lived in Kansas City and his wife, and there were just the 6 of us for dinner, and I cooked the dinner. And we just had this wonderful opportunity to be with them. And the next day they were going to fly back east, but we took them to Fort Leavenworth. And one of the things that John wanted Joanne to see was the house where he and Barbara had lived when he was a student. And he was so complimentary of Barbara because they were very small quarters and there were 3 bedrooms, and she made sure that he had one of them for his use to study for the Grand General Staff College.
Yeah.
They slept on another one, and the children, I think that's before you were born.
Everything happened before I was born.
He just really wanted her to see Leavenworth, and we were so pleased to show them our side of Leavenworth too. So, and that was just one of the good experiences besides the trip to Europe, which was
Yeah.
a fantastic experience, wasn't it?
It was, absolutely. In fact, the last
Thank you.
the last year, he must have sent that picture of Joanne and him aboard the USS Eisenhower when we went on that. Is that? It was 90, but that wasn't the same trip. I apologize, but he was so proud of that picture.
It was 1990 that we went to Europe, and then.
Yes, we did kind of a footsteps.
And, yeah, because
Yeah.
it was all, the trip to Europe was in connection with the celebration of the 100th birthday by the Army, right?
Yeah.
In Europe, and Bob was the one who planned all that, and he and John had several meetings before you even went to Europe. So
It was a wonderful time.
it was a wonderful trip, and I'm so glad I got to go too.
Mac?
Tim, I have a couple of memories of John. Gracious is the word. I mean, he was always very gracious. And he was here for one event, and I don't remember exactly which one, but he was going to be introduced, and the person introducing him, I was up at the head table too, but I wasn't doing the introductions. He said, "You want to be a General Eisenhower, Ambassador Eisenhower?" And he said, it wasn't for titles. "I'll be wearing my Eisenhower mask," he said. So you don't need to say anything on it. They'll know who I am. And when we dedicated the statue, he said, "I'm not an expert on too many things, but I am about likenesses of my father, and this is a good one." And the sculptor just beamed when he heard that. It was really nice. But he was very, very gracious and very smart, and I think he did have the Eisenhower temper, which I think all the kids have inherited. I'm sorry.
You must be referring to my sister Susan.
But a real class act. And the fact he was asked one time, "Do you want to be introduced to a general?" He said, "No, there was only one General Eisenhower." So, even though he was a brigadier general in the Army Reserve, quite a fine gentleman.
Well, I think in the discussions that Mitch and I had in the weeks leading up to this program, just that thing about John, that graciousness, and the fact that he lived in this immense shadow of not just the General Eisenhower, but the President Eisenhower, but became his own man, is such an accomplishment. And I think that's really, when you see what befalls the children of other famous leaders and others, that really is an accomplishment.
Yeah, the first book I wrote was about also a World War I book about Americans and Americans who fought with the British, and that took place in Belgium. And I nervously called John up one day and asked if he would do the introduction. Didn't even hesitate. In fact, he had the thing done in like 3 days after I called him. It is a brilliant piece of prose that really set the book up and talking about his time as the ambassador and how he went to the ABMC cemetery and visited the graves, and he was very generous about what I had written in the book. And it was something, again, that he didn't have to do that, but he did it, and something I really appreciated.
Well, we're about to the end of our allotted time. I'm
on the 4th book.
Are they all military based?
They are. The first one, the World War I book, and then I did a couple of small biographies, one of MacArthur and Grant, which John helped me with the Grant book, giving his own ideas, because Civil War was a period that he was greatly interested in. Can't help if you're living in the Gettysburg area, but in being interested in the Civil War. And then the one I'm writing now on the Muse Argonne that he also had a lot of influence on as well.
Gina,
Did any of the kids get the writing gene?
Well, my brother definitely did. Susie writes quite a bit. I've been working on the same book for 14 years, so although I enjoy writing. But I have to admit, one time I was having trouble in an English class, and Daddy said, "Oh, well, you can borrow my book from," he had his book from high school. And I thought, okay, great. And I opened it up, and it says, "Congratulations, John Eisenhower, highest senior scholastic average." And I went, oh, no pressure. Okay.
Mary, is there a favorite story you haven't told us about your dad?
There's so many that I would keep us here until morning, probably. But there's another funny one if we want to leave it on an up note. But he was having, one of his sunglasses mornings, let's put it that way. And I think my granddad might have been a little miffed at him, because suddenly at, like 8 a.m., everybody was up and we were to be dressed to ride. He had horses on the farm, and we were all going to go riding. And so, everybody reluctantly went riding at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he's like kind of working us all. And I guess Daddy just didn't pay enough attention, and his horse, Doodly-Doo, decided it was going back to the barn. And it took Daddy completely off guard. So in his military way, he was going, "Whoa, damn it! Whoa, damn it!" all the way back to the barn.
Sure.
Mary, I have two questions. Did you ever get the $75 for the trip?
I did.
Okay.
I did. I caught him in a weak moment.
And then, being the youngest, do you feel you had a special relationship with him?
It was very special. This may sound a little strange, but he took his post in Belgium when Granddad had been gone less than a month. Granddad died March 28th, and he was the middle of April when he went over, so he was still very bereaved. And I don't know, I caught him crying once, and for a West Pointer, that, you don't do that, or at least not in his day. And we ended up talking till about 4 o'clock in the morning, and and we were like that from that moment on. We were best friends. And I'll never forget, I think one of the things that I'll treasure, if there's anything to treasure about his passing, but when we got him home, there was a hospice nurse, and there was somebody who was helping to take care of him, and of course Joanne was there too. So I went out on the deck and I started returning phone calls because my siblings had been ringing the phone off the hook. And all of a sudden I heard this, "Mary?" And I mean, it sounded like I was in trouble, and I didn't know he had that kind of lung power left. So I threw the cell phone, I'm surprised it didn't go in the bay, and ran in. And he said, "Let me see if I can still sit up." But I was the only one he trusted with that, because he was a very proud person. And he did, and then he said, "Okay." And he laid back down. But knowing my dad throughout his life, that was the ultimate trust, really. Because he was in a hospital gown and the whole bit. So, and I'll always cherish that he called for me.
I noticed in one of the pictures, looks like John wearing an a scout uniform.
Yes,
Was he an Eagle Scout?
he was an Eagle Scout. Yep. Made it all the way to the top. I don't know if his father could say the same thing. He might have outranked his father.
Try to get back to that picture. I believe Gerald Ford's the first president to have been an Eagle Scout. Of course, there really wouldn't have been Scouts at the time that Ike was growing up.
Well, that's true.
But there he is. Yeah, what a great picture.
He looks so, official.
He does. It's like a park ranger. Well, if there aren't any additional questions or comments, I want to thank our guests, Mary Jean Eisenhower and Mitch Yockelson, for such a nice memory of, or evening of sharing their memories of John Eisenhower. And I know many of us here have very nice memories of John too, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank you for thinking of my father and for this program.
Absolutely.
That was
We are
very,
honored.
very sweet.
We're honored. Thank you.